I should tell you, I feel like I'm at a convention of masked bandits. I don't quite know what to make of that. But we've been sitting here for an hour. Why don't you take a minute just to breathe? And if you want to stand up for a minute or whatever we get the blood going. I guess if you're like me, I'm kind of stiff with age and getting a chance to just move about. Just breathe in, breathe out, think some happy thoughts. And if you're feeling refreshed, then sit down. And when you all sit down again, I'll know you're ready to rock and roll. And I want to thank you all for being here today. We have a good group of people here, and you're making, oh, I forgot, I'm supposed to stay over here because the Zoom camera doesn't follow. I forgot. I apologize for that, folks out there. But anyway, just by being here, you're already making a difference. And what you're doing is you're really defining what the CCRC of the future, how people will age in the future. How do people want to age? How do they want to be treated in their old age? That's all of what we're doing. So I thought I'd start just by telling you a little bit of my story, which begins with my grandmother. When I was a boy growing up, my grandmother was already, well, I guess we'd call it retired, but she had an epilepsy, so she'd always had a bit of a disability. And she lived in a boarding house in Philadelphia, and we lived near New York City. And so one of the highlights of my childhood was driving with my father down to see his mother, because that was a chance that I had to be with my father. And people aging in that era, many of them did live in boarding houses like that. I remember Miss Garrett, her neighbor, a wonderful woman, and she liked me and I liked her, and that was wonderful. And that was fine until my grandmother got what we used to call senility. Do any of you remember the word senility? I think that's a word that's no longer politically correct. So I'm not sure what we call it today, mentally disadvantaged or memory challenged or something like that. But anyway, she got senility and she wound up in the state hospital for the insane. So that's the way people of her generation approached old age. Each era has its own character. Now, my father dropped dead of a heart attack at age 72, so that wasn't really a problem. That was a good way to go. And he never had to worry about aging. But then my mother was alone and she was determined to stay in that big old house. And that went along very well until one day she had a minor stroke and she was hospitalized for about 5 days, after which the doctor recommended that she go to a nursing home in New Hampshire, New Jersey, actually, New Providence, New Jersey, excuse me. And for rehab. So he thought she'd be there for 2 weeks for rehab. Well, she spent the next 12 years of her life there because she had lost her confidence about living. And that wasn't the best solution. So when it came time for Valerie and me to think about it, and I thought back to how my father had died suddenly at age 72, and my grandfather had died about the same age. So I thought, gosh, my genetics is going to take me off the earth at age 72. And I really didn't want my wife to be alone. She'd been pretty good to me. This is a second wife. So the second wife is the best one. But anyway, so I wanted her to be well cared for. So that was what brought us into a continuing care retirement community. I can tell you that as an actuary working in the insurance industry, I naturally assumed that CCRC were well regulated, and they are for health and safety matters. But when it came to finances, that was a different matter. So that's how I got to begin to be interested in this, and I got active in the field. It's like if you were a bridge builder and you saw that a bridge was unsound. It might be one in Tacony or somewhere like that. And it turned out to just not be built right. Well, you wouldn't be able to rest until you got the thing fixed. And that's kind of what I've done going forward. So here's what I want to talk to you about today. First, we just had a big gathering of Leading Age. If you all know, I don't know whether you do know, but Leading Age is the organization of the providers. You are not members in Leading Age. Only providers are members in Leading Age. And so they represent the providers. And so they had a big meeting in Denver, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Then we'll talk about what's good in CCRC living and what needs work. And then what the state of the industry is right now. And you know, because you live with the people here in Skyline, certainly know that big changes are coming along because your organization has become so complex it needs a second central office. And then finally, we have time for questions and answers. So here's a picture of the group at the Leading Age Conference. By the way, this was earlier this past week. They met from last Sunday to Wednesday, or at least I left on Wednesday. I think they may have still been going on. And at one time, they would get 8,000 to 10,000 people, depending on where they met. I think this year, because they're coming out of the pandemic, they only had about 5,000 there. But you can see them sitting up, see that tiers go way up. There's an enormous gathering of people. And in that group, there were 52 residents. I happen to know that because the residents registered in a separate category. And my watch is talking to me. I don't know what it's saying. But anyway, the 52 residents, and Leading Age had one event for residents. 20 showed up. And about half of the 20 came from a single CCRC that had sent a busload in to attend the meeting. So what brings all these people to Denver? Well, they need continuing education credit. And you can see how interesting it is to get continuing education credit. It's about as interesting as listening to us prattle along here today. So I should, by the way, I should warn you that my wife insisted that I rehearse this. And when I tried to rehearse it for her, she fell asleep. So if you get sleepy, please feel free to just go right ahead and sleep. But you can see that getting CE credit is not the most fascinating thing in the world. Then there's the exhibit hall. And that's where the money is. Boy, is there money. And look, this is, as you enter the exhibit hall, there are about 1,500, 2,000, something like that number of vendors who want to sell to spend the money that you pay into your CCRC. So they want to suggest to your owners ways in which they can spend their money. And one of the big money operations is Ziegler. Ziegler is a big financial firm, and they specialize in running, excuse me, my nose is running. They specialize in running tax-exempt bonds. So that's something that you may have encountered. So that's enough about the Leading Age meeting. I can just tell you that you as residents are frequently, or I should say we as residents, because after all, I'm one of you really. But so we as residents are spoken of constantly during the meeting as they. So the we at Leading Age are the people who make their living from the fees you pay, and the they are the people who are in the pews, if you will. And one of the programs that I went to there, Jeffrey Vickers, who's the CEO of Meadow Lee's, a CCRC in New Jersey, he spoke of the residents as being problematic. He was talking to new board members and telling board members what they needed to be careful of. And he said, there's a new activism occurring among the residents. And that's a threat to the industry. And so by being here, you are activists, so you're a threat. So be careful with that, because these are people who are really well-intentioned. They're trying to do the best they can, and they will be listening. And I believe that this industry will not respond to us and our generation as merely a threat. I think it's going to change and become attractive. So we are defining the future so that we don't go back and wind up living in a boarding house like my grandmother did. We can do better than what we're doing now. So moving right along, we can go quicker now because you know all this. First, you've made a responsible choice. You've chosen not to be a burden for others. You've taken care of things. You've moved to a place where there are services available and the food's good and it's good living. The communal life is far more beneficial than I ever dreamt it would be. Moving into a CCRC is one of the best decisions that you can make. It's a hassle-free life. You have a light bulb out, call maintenance. I don't know that that's everywhere, but it's gotten so that a lot of people, we even have some people where they provide their toilet paper, but that's a whole nother thing. And you have the healthcare right on standby, right where you are. If you need help, just push a button. It's wonderful. And there's also a considerable concern for safety, as you see here in this room with all the wonderful masks. And I appreciate your wearing. I'm not wearing a mask because I know that for many of you, because it's true for me, if I speak to somebody, or somebody who's wearing a mask speaks to me, I don't know what they're saying. Because I think as my hearing is going, I guess you start doing more visually than you ever imagined you could. So what needs work? Well, we've talked about the capital financing, and capital financing is problematic for a nonprofit. So the only way they can really raise equity capital is to charge entrance fees. So you'd think you'd get a whole prospectus with your entrance fee, because after all, you're investing and putting at risk your capital to secure debt, just like you were making a down payment on a mortgage for a home you own. But here, you're making a down payment on a home they own. So that should be a security, right? That should be regulated by the SEC, but it's not. And we need fair contracts. We'll get into that in more detail. Nonprofits typically don't manage their costs quite as much as does a lean run, well-managed for-profit enterprise. We'd like to have resident-centric governance. Wouldn't it be nice if you had a voice in whether your money is spent on expansion? It may be wonderful to have an expansion program because it can open the CCRC lifestyle to more people, and that's a positive thing. That's something we might be willing to invest in. But wouldn't it be nice to have a say in whether you do that? We need transparency, and many of the contracts require that the residents have full transparency, including turning over your income tax forms and everything, if they request it. And we deserve to have the same transparency from providers that they expect from us. And I think we deserve to, as residents, as the consumers, as the customers for this business, to have the same respect that most well-run businesses give to their customers. Old age shouldn't be a time of failure. It should be a time of empowerment. After all, we no longer have to kiss ass with an employer. We're free, and we can give voice to whatever we want to say. So, looking at contracts, and of course, if it's a contract, there's fine print. So this is fine print. I don't expect you to read this, but I'm going to point out a couple of provisions here. These are taken from a model contract that was drafted by Paul Gordon of Hanson Bridget, which is a big law firm that favors providers. And it's a model that's made available by the American Senior Housing Association. You can buy the whole model contract for $100. And so here's a typical contract provision in many contracts. Yours is maybe different, or if Paul Gordon drafted your contract, it probably isn't. You, resident, agreed to be bound by all the policies. Notice that the word policies is italicized here. That's my doing. By all the policies, rules, and regulations of the community as they now exist, or as they may later be amended. You hereby acknowledge receipt of a copy of the current resident handbook of the community, which is attached here to as Appendix A. Well, needless to say, the policies and procedures manual for a CCRC can be huge. And I'm willing to bet that there are very few in this room who've ever actually seen or read or dipped into the policies and procedures manual for your CCRC. They all have one. How many of you have actually read the policies and procedures manual where you live? 1, 2, 3, 4. That's quite a large number out of this group. So, but you're bound by that. And if that changes without your knowing it, suddenly your contract's amended without your agreeing to the amendment. That's astounding in legal parlance. But here's an extreme. And this is an actual sentence from a contract that my sister had to sign. My sister moved, she doesn't live in the same CCRC as I do because we don't have a type A contract and she's not a wealthy person. Type A is a care inclusive contract. You pay the same whether you need care or you just are on your own, if you're independent. And so your cost doesn't go up as you need care. And so she needed that protection because she's just not wealthy. So she and her husband moved it. But here's what they had to sign. I, the resident, understand and agree that at any time and from time to time, all without notice to me and without affecting your rights or my obligations hereunder, you, the provider, may alter any terms of the residence agreement or any part of it, including renewing, compromising, extending, or accelerating, only lawyers can write like that, or otherwise changing the time for payment of amounts due hereunder. It's just hard for me to imagine that that is a valid, enforceable contract. That really bothers me. So I'll just mention two other provisions. There we go. Well, the first, and these go back to the Paul Gordon model contract, financial subordination. And this goes to your investment in entrance fees that you may have thought were a down payment for future services under the contract that you were accepting. Your rights under this agreement are and shall be subordinate to the rights of a secured lender under any mortgage, deed of trust, or other senior security interest that is placed on operator's property now or in the future. So if your contract has that in it, you know exactly where you stand. And the other one that really bothers me is forcing people to give up their constitutional right to fair adjudication of disputes before they even walk in the door. Both parties give up their constitutional right to have any such dispute decided in a court of law before a jury and instead accept the use of arbitration. Now, who drafts the contract? The provider drafts the contract. It's the provider's contract. Why do they want the mandatory arbitration in there? Because it favors their interests. It's not your friend. That's not a positive thing. So when you sign your contract, all right, that's enough on contracts. State of the CCRC industry. First, despite the feeling that these places are being built and there's expansion everywhere, the truth of the matter is that the demographics are growing at the same time. So if you look at the number of people accepting residents as a percentage of the market, the industry's market share is declining. At the same time, financiers like Ziegler, who you saw in the exhibit hall, and development advisors like Greystone, I don't know whether any of you are familiar, but Greystone is a big firm that promote, they promote expansion. They make their money by expansion. They do market survey studies to see if the market will absorb what they're building. But once it's built, they walk away. They're not responsible. It's up to the sales department to fill those apartments. And public skepticism is growing. This is also a challenge for the industry. It's not all fair, but the fact is that nursing homes got a bad rap during the pandemic. It wasn't all fair because they're caring for the most frail and the most vulnerable people. So you'd expect them to have problems, but that has washed off on the public, and there's a growing skepticism whether moving into these places is safe or not. I don't think that's appropriate, but that's the reality for now. So that'll probably go away. Active adult communities are becoming popular. I heard a talk the other day by a fellow named Bill Pettit. Bill Pettit, he's had a 30-year career in senior living, building CCRCs. And he was asked, he's now 73 years old. So he was asked, where do you think you'd like to go for your retirement? And he said, I'm glad you asked that question. And to be perfectly frank, I plan to move into an active adult community because they can deliver the same thing that I need for half the cost of a full service community. Half the cost. I don't know where he gets that number from. I won't defend it, but that's what he said. Seemed a little hard to me. The industry, particularly this year, this is a very tough budget year, 2023. They have a triple threat of inflation. Who knows where it's going to go? We just don't know. Labor shortages, rising interest rates, and supply chain lags. You know how long it takes to get a refrigerator? If your refrigerator busts, how long it takes to get a refrigerator? I don't know whether any of you have had that. We had that. And we finally got a refrigerator from a woman who died. I had to get it that way, but it was nice to have a working refrigerator. And finally, there's the capital challenge. And to put it in graphical terms, I've taken here three large CCRCs in downtown Seattle, and I'm not saying who they are, because this shouldn't be about finger pointing. This is about getting a whole industry onto a sound basis. But here's the trend of net worth. Now, net worth is the excess of assets over liabilities. Liabilities are the financial valuation of the promises made in those contracts and in the marketing material. And the assets are the resources available to meet those promises. So if the resources available to meet promises isn't greater than what's going to cost to provide the promises, you got a problem. And the fact is that you can meet that standard and you can operate on a positive basis. Because you see here, one of these downtown Seattle CCRCs is doing the job and they're looking strong, while the others are deepening their decline into insolvency. And I can assure you that digging out of a $120 million hole is an uphill climb. So what could the industry do to become more trustworthy? First, they could invite robust regulation so that when you move in, you could have the assurance that somebody's looking out for you to ensure that you have fair contracts, valid accounting, and that the finances are run on a basis that's going to assure that when you're 99 and no longer able to cope intelligently with how things that are happening to you, your place won't just collapse and fail. You may be able to still live in the same apartment, but if you go through a bankruptcy when you're confused in 95, 96, that's a difficult thing. So I think that it's in the best interests of this industry to support you and WACRA in your effort to get more robust oversight. And I can assure you that in having this study that Donna and Kim were talking about, Washington is now taking the lead nationwide. For example, North Carolina up to now has had the strongest disclosure laws for CCRCs. Right now, Leading Age North Carolina is using funds that they get from resident fees to lobby against the best interests of residents to reduce the disclosure burden in the state of North Carolina. They're trying to get out from under what Harry Groves put in place. Harry Groves was a lawyer who moved into a CCRC years ago. He was shocked. He walked the halls of the legislature in North Carolina and got them very good disclosure laws. As a lawyer, he didn't think of the finance part, he thought about disclosure, but anyway. And we could have consumer-oriented accreditation. There is an accreditation organization called Continuing Care Accreditation Commission. It was taken over by a place that accredits homes for the disabled, that sort of thing. But as one example, there was a community in Jacksonville, Florida, that was seized by the insurance commissioner because its finances were failing. And it was being operated under receivership by the insurance commissioner in Florida because they already have much stronger laws than you have here. And during that time, the accreditation people continued to accredit it to prospective residents as suitable for them to invest their entrance fees in, even knowing that all their entrance fee would do is to reduce the degree of the insolvency. And when I asked them at a Leading Age meeting, I asked them, how can you accredit a place that's in receivership? They said, well, these are our clients. You can't hurt your clients when they're down. I don't think that kind of accreditation isn't worth enough. Besides, the providers don't like it because it costs them a lot of money. But the main thing is that the industry needs to get its reputation back. Word of mouth is the biggest thing. You people are the best sales resource your CCRC have. They can have salespeople out peddling the street, running seminars, bringing speakers, serving cookies and lemonade. But the fact is that if you say you're happy where you live, your friends who have not yet made that move are listening. And that's where the rubber hits the road. So finally, I thought I'd touch on the fact that there are a lot of things that you can do that don't require management approval. To begin with, you don't need managerial consent to go talk to the city council, the local government, county government, or even to meet with your local state legislator. Our freedom of speech is not yet that limited. Second, you can partner. How many of you have heard of the village movement? A few. Okay, the village movement is a new grassroots movement. It began about 10 or 15 years ago in Boston, but it's spreading nationwide, and it's particularly strong here in Washington, actually, surprisingly. And it's grassroots, younger retired people, if you will, people in their late 60s and early 70s for the most part, who come together for common purposes and form villages to get the social benefit that they get. Of course, you can do that at a senior center, but this is an alternative route, and it has the advantage that it's bottom up rather than top down. There's no reason why a resident group can't form a village. You can be a member, you can live in a CCRC and be a member of a village, and the village can include outside people, including prospects. And believe me, if you form such an organization, a village, and there are resources available, I put a link here where you can find out how to form such a village. If you form such a village, the marketing people are going to take notice, and they'll take you pretty seriously, because once you've got prospective members in an organization aligned with you, they're going to notice. But I think there's nothing, you should keep management informed what you're doing. Let management know. Don't blindside them, but don't be stymied by management either. Their interests align with yours. They should align more closely, but they're not totally congruent. So I think if you it's only common courtesy to let them know what you're up to. Finally, you can develop advocacy programs around key issues. I've mentioned two here. One is, there's no reason why you can't advocate with local authorities for better health and transportation support for older people generally, because that'll just come back and help you where you live. And you can advocate for senior-friendly technology and support. Where I live, we lobbied the provider, and we now have a resident technology assistant. Did you ever wonder why the employees are so much better able to use their computers and all their little gadgets than most of the residents are? Well, the reason is because for employees, there are help desks, and there are staff who are there to help them when they get stuck. And the residents haven't had that. So we lobbied our provider, and we now have a resident technology assistant on the premises. And I'll confess that a lot of the calls she gets, she goes out, she'll visit, come in your house, see what's up. And she'll go in and somebody will have 4 remotes lined up. And they're trying to tune the TV with the DVR remote. That's a common kind of problem. But still having that is wonderful. So you could do that possibly in partnership with the senior center. Many senior centers do have technology support, or villages, because the villages often provide that kind of support. So to review, this is what we were going to do. Take a look at what happened when the industry gathered for its annual confab in Denver last week. We've looked at what's good in CCRC living and how CCRC management can improve their market reach by taking some steps to improve it. We've looked at the challenges. This is such a challenging time for CCRCs. We've looked at the state of the industry. And with that, we can take Q&A.
Why don't you see if there are any questions?
Okay, let's see. Now, I've been told I'd love to come down, be able to come down there and be amongst you, but with the Zoom, I keep forgetting the Zoom. You've got to. So here's a woman down here who's got a question.
The big difference. What's the big difference between nonprofit and for-profit CCRC?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that question. Let's see. The biggest difference is whether you pay your fair share of taxes. If you're, okay. If you're a nonprofit, typically you're tax exempt. Now, the big number, of course, is property tax. You have to pay property taxes. So, and that varies a lot from state to state. In some states, even though the CCRCs are exempt under 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code, and that's because, well, we'll get back to that. But anyway, they still have to pay property taxes. So there are many states where they pay property taxes. In the state of Washington, there's a law, I don't know whether the industry lobbied to get it or not, that if 75% of the financing of the enterprise is through tax exempt bonds, and if they have some number of low income apartments, what they call affordable apartments, then they don't have to pay property taxes in the state of Washington. And so, of course, that's something they really like. Who wants to pay taxes? But the fact is that they do use community services, so you can imagine how the municipal leaders think about it if you're not paying your fair share of costs and you're using municipal services. So I think the main difference and the reason why it matters so hard to them is twofold. One is they avoid having to pay their fair share of taxes. And number two, in the public perception, nonprofits are good and for-profits increasingly are seen as bad. But there's no reason why a for-profit can't be run on a good basis. They could be run by nonprofit principles and still pay taxes. And there's no reason why a nonprofit can't be run on egocentric whims of the CEO. So, greed, all those things, I think it fits them. Thank you for that question. There's one over here. We need the microphone because of the Zoom audience.
Jack, is there any state which, in your opinion, currently has an effective and robust CCRC regulatory scheme in place?
Not really, not really. Let me give three examples that come to mind offhand. New York tried to go heavily into the insurance model of regulation.
Jack, repeat the question.
Oh, the microphone was, okay, he asked, is there any state that's doing it right? Okay, and the answer is not really. There are many states that have no regulation whatsoever. You deal with a frail, gullible population, and you're in a state where the leaders of that state are so inept that there's no protection whatsoever. That's almost unimaginable. But New York State went the farthest toward requiring oversight that was comparable to what insurance companies are subject to. The insurance companies are regulated at the state level. That's why we keep going there. But, the industry complained that that was too onerous. And so New York had to back off from requiring them to meet the same capital standards as insurance companies, because they just said, we're unable to raise that kind of capital and still be nonprofit. That was the argument. North Carolina, as I mentioned, has this extensive disclosure laws, which were put in place by Harry Groves, who was a brilliant lawyer, and he wound up as president of a law school, I forget which one. And I think he lived in Caroline Meadows, if I remember correctly now, which is an excellent CCRC in North Carolina. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Florida has a very active resident association, so the industry has to notice that. In Florida, half the residents in the state are members of the Florida Continuing Care, Life Care. They call it the Florida Life Care Residents Association. Half. And that's because of a fellow named Bennett Napier, who's their paid executive director for that association, who traveled the state and recruited them into, residents joining, and he set up a chapter method that worked very effectively in Florida. So that you heard mentioned that Florida has some laws that are salutary, and that's positive. But now that he's got that all set up, he's basically a lobbyist. So what happens is he works every year with the lobbyists for the providers, and they come up with some little tweak in the law that they can tout to their members that says that they've advanced things for the year. And so Florida has the same number of bankruptcies as any other state as a result. But the residents do have some protection there. So probably Florida would be the best model to look to.
Well, I have a question about the election of board members. Should it be done by the residents? That's the first question. But then even if you are elected, then you become, you have a fiduciary responsibility to the organization. So you are no longer representing the residents, but the organization. And that makes it difficult, particularly if you are maybe one or two persons who are residents who are on the board.
I think I follow the question. Excuse me. One of the panels that I attended, I mentioned already Jeffrey Vickers saying that residents are a threat, or activist residents are a threat. And he cited NACRA, among other things, as problematic. And but they were emphasizing to these board members. There's a room full of people who are new board members that are being instructed in what their role is. And the lawyer, June Woolery from National Church Residents, who was leading the presentation, advised them of just what you just said. You have a fiduciary responsibility. Put the interests of the enterprise before your own interests, and you have a duty of loyalty, care, and obedience, and that's all wrapped up in that fiduciary thing. So when time came for questions, I asked her, I said, well, since the board members have a fiduciary responsibility to the enterprise, does the enterprise in its contracts say that it has a fiduciary responsibility for the residents to put their needs first? Well, she stuttered a little bit and finally she said, well, we take very good care of our residents. So I think, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it's hard for them to be advocates. That's what I'm saying.
Oh, he's saying it's hard for resident directors to be advocates. I agree. I don't think a board should never be a representative body. A board is there to serve as an advisor to the management, principally the CEO, to select a CEO when there's a vacancy, to support the CEO during his tenure, and if the CEO goes off course, to pull the plug. That's it. That's what their responsibility is. Now, in that advisory role, if you can bring together a skill set that helps flesh out the CEO in areas where he may be less knowledgeable, that's very valuable and very useful to the CEO. Plus, when a CEO has a bright idea, usually the staff members say, oh, that's a wonderful idea, because, that's the nature of things. You get along in an organization to advance by looking good in the eyes of the CEO. So valuable for a CEO who really wants to excel is to have a board that he can go to with those bright ideas and they say, now, did you think of this? How are you going to, if you were going to do one thing to reduce the risk of our doing that, what would that one thing be? That's a very good question for a director to ask. And so these are nonprofit boards mostly. And often what happens is executives who are very good in their own enterprise, for-profit enterprise, and run it on lean principles and customer orientation, when they move on to a nonprofit board, their whole mindset changes and they put on a charitable hat and think they're caring for these poor, helpless little old people. And that changes the whole dynamic. But ideally, it all begins with a strong CEO who's got high values, high ethics, and is minded to really do a positive job for the customers of the organization. Way back there. Oh, two. I did.
Jack, in the event of a catastrophic occasion of some kind, do traditional CCRCs have any provision for taking care of many residents who might no longer have a place to live?
You mean if the community was actually
Yes.
destroyed,
Yes,
like that building in Florida that collapsed?
yes. Are we living under the guise of an earthquake? Yes.
I don't know what the situation here is. In most jurisdictions, the CCRCs do have agreements with each other to take in people in time of need. So, for example, we had terrible fires in Carlsbad that threatened communities near us, and we took them in on a temporary basis. So I think the answer is that yes, in the best run ones, it's not formalized, but I think most of these communities do follow a best practice of having provision for residents who are no longer able to function if something like that occurs.
Who pays the cost?
Jack, just as a
Right,
clarification.
right, here, hold on. for a minute.
Hold on.
Just a quick clarification. This is the kind of thing that you need to look to your individual contracts to understand what's covered and what's not. I recently looked at a contract that has some pretty big limitations on what the entity is going to do if something happens to your unit. And what your obligations are in terms of covering your personal property, et cetera. So I strongly urge you to look at your contract and understand what it says, because it can vary.
Okay, I agree with that. Generally, people who take the contract to a lawyer before they sign it, the lawyer says, well, I'm not expert in this area, or they say, well, I can't really advise you to sign that, but if that's where you really want to live, go ahead. So, insurance contracts are regulated to be fair. For example, in most CCRC contracts, residents before admission on the application are required to disclose their assets. And most contracts require that you warrant what your assets are. That means that if you had invested with Bernie Madoff and everything got lost, you're still on the hook for what you told them you thought you had with Bernie Madoff. In insurance practice, when you also do an application, their insurance companies are not allowed to require you to warrant the information on the application. You only need to answer to the best of your knowledge and belief, which is a fair standard. But this industry has not, its finances and contracts haven't really been regulated. So naturally, you hire a lawyer and you say, gee, we want a contract that's going to cause us not to have disruptive resident litigation. You're going to please your client.
Jack, I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Okay, there was a question over here, somebody who was, yeah.
I've noticed that in a for-profit CCRC, that many of them have many tiers of subsidiaries, affiliates, and often the arrangements between the actual CCRC, for which you get a budget, and these tiered subsidiaries or affiliates and so on are not really explained to the residents, and the finances among these different affiliates and so on are not transparent at all. Have you had any occasion to run into these problems? And if so, what would your advice be?
Well, yes, that is a challenge. It's not just a challenge for for-profits. I'm pretty sure that if you've looked at the bylaws of the corporate owner of the property where you live, if you're living in a nonprofit, Article 2 says either that the corporation has no members or that the corporation has a sole corporate member. And they can use that sole corporate member to operate and have control and create a holding company structure. So I'm sure you know about the Rogue Valley Manor case where that became an issue because Rogue Valley Manor had been a standalone, and then somebody came in and advised them to form an upstream holding company, and things worked out in a way that displeased the residents. So the residents had to litigate to get certain standing. And I won't go into the pluses and minuses of what I think about that. But there are also abuses on the for-profit side. For example, with V Palo Alto. V used to be Classic Residence by Hyatt. My wife likes to say that the naming firms, they hire naming firms that get their names like they can't think up a name. And so And she said, well, those naming firms must charge by the letter, because why else would you call the place V? But at V Palo Alto, they got a 99-year lease to build a CCRC, a for-profit CCRC, on the Stanford University campus. And that was so popular with wealthy graduates of Stanford that they were able to price the recurring fees as though they could run the whole thing as a rental property. So, but they charged entrance fees. So the provider decided that the entrance fees were pure profit. So they sent them out of state, and there's a lawsuit. I think the lawsuit's still pending. And the lead person on that lawsuit, Burton Richter, had been a Nobel Prize winner in physics, who felt he'd been snookered by taking this deal. And I thought, well, how are you ever going to argue in a court of law that a Nobel Prize winner in physics got snookered on the mathematical thing like that? I think the lawsuit never made much sense to me, but I think it's still out there. So that if you remember in Bleak House, how Dickens had the lawsuit go on for generations. I think that if you want to find an interesting lawsuit, look up that V Palo Alto litigation. It's going to go on and on for many years.